Hey, podcaster, welcome to the podcast space. I'm Anik Xavier. I'll be the host of the show, and I am delighted to have you on the other side. All right, first things first, what is this podcast about? Well, if you love understanding the podcast world a bit better, if you want to improve your strategy, if you want to learn about how people are actually growing their show, but in a way that actually feels authentic, I'm going to tell you all about that. This show is going to be pretty much a very interactive podcast. And so always feel free to let me know what you want to hear, either in this description or on social media at the podcast space. So a few things that I've been hearing from you, podcasting people, is that you want to hear more about how to work on your strategy. And so that's actually what my background is. I want to help you figure out exactly what is the strategy that is going to get you to grow online, to grow your show, but also grow your podcast community, grow your business if you have a business, and grow your authority online, your digital footprint. And so my motto is progress over perfection. I love content strategy. And so a lot of people talk about what do you talk about on social media, but I hadn't seen a lot of people talk about how do you talk about content strategy for your podcast and how to integrate your podcast in all facets of your online business or on the online facet of your business. Also, if you don't have a business, I want to teach you how to grow your show. I promise you that I will share very actionable tips and things that you can implement today, you can implement within a week or a month, but it's really about giving you awareness about how the podcast industry works, how you can grow your community in a way that works for you. And we've all been there where we maybe followed our favorite creators, our favorite podcasters, and they talk about strategies that kind of work for a very specific type of person. But I am really passionate about helping you figure out a strategy that works for you with your personality, with your skill set, and it doesn't feel overwhelming because, life is all about finding happiness in the things that we do. And if you're not enjoying your podcast, well, maybe it's just because you don't have the right strategy and you haven't tried something yet. So all of this will be a journey. I've been producing podcasts since 2008. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey itself in a second, but I want to let you know exactly if this show is for you, what you can expect, because I think that this first episode is so important to know, hey, do I want to hear these podcasts? If nobody recommended you these podcasts, if you found it on YouTube, I'm going to lay the ground on what you're going to be kind of learning, because everyone has a different style. My teaching style is different than anyone else. So if you're looking for someone who's going to teach you all the ins and out of technology and the latest tools and the latest kind of gear, I'm not that person, so ask me who that person could be and I'll let you know, because I have so many other creators in the industry that I think are doing an amazing job, so you can go and check them out. But if you're you know what, I really want to figure out a long-term strategy to grow my podcast or just figure out a way to make this show work for me, that is my expertise, so stick around. And so a couple of things. I'm going to combine series of solo episodes, kind of short and actionable shows, tell you about all of my secrets in my podcast journey, but also as a professional, maybe in my years in working in radio, or maybe as a journalist, or maybe working in digital marketing, the things that helped me grow the shows that I was producing or actually grow my brand online. So the biggest thing that I think you have to consider is really understanding that your podcast is part of your online efforts. And so once you understand that it has to be integrated in everything that you do, it just feels less overwhelming. It makes more sense. So I'm going to teach you about all of these things. There will be those shows where I'll be kind of explaining things that I've done in the past, things that worked, things that didn't. And I'm going to bring you along in the journey. This podcast, as I mentioned, is going to be about what works, what doesn't, but I'm going to tell you when things don't go right. This podcast is about making progress and pushing things a bit further, in your comfort zone. So making this podcast video format for me was kind of really interesting, because I was a live stream producer, so I was behind the scenes helping people, but I gotta tell you that it's very different being behind the scenes, running everything, the cameras, but being in front of the camera, it is different. And so there's so much that I'm going to be learning. The lessons from recording these first video podcast will be a separate podcast episode. I can promise you that. And so actually, for true transparency, this is take 2. I recorded the first episode and I was like, you know what? I said a few things that I think that worked video format, but for the people listening on audio platforms, it kind of didn't make a lot of sense. And so I was like, all right, let's backtrack and record this. I hesitated so much before recording this because I was like, will this work as it is? And I really took a lot of time to think about it. And I decided that no, I want to re-record this and make sure that it all makes sense. And so it's been such an interesting journey since launching the podcast space in January of 2020. The company was originally set up to be a podcast agency that was going to help podcasters who are working toward the betterment of their communities really grow their shows in terms of the production side. So editing, publishing, distributing podcasts, figuring out obviously like what is the strategy behind this show. But through the years and with the pandemic, I really pivoted into something that really brings me a lot of more interest. So that is actually the content strategy. And so educating people. So that's why it will be such a big part of this show will be solo episodes. Now, something that I haven't told you about is the interviews. Now, there won't be a lot of interviews. Once a month, there'll be shows that focus on some podcasters or business owners who are using their show in ways that I think is really helpful for you to hear about, like learn from their ups and downs. What are the strategies that actually are working for them, things that you could test yourself, but also at the same time, some of these people that I've met through my over 10 years in the industry are people who have tools in the podcast industry. And these tools that I'm going to be bringing into you, to your awareness, are tools that either I've tested or that I believe are really helpful for people like you. So I won't be bringing in people that just for the sake of it, like, oh my gosh, I really want this person in, and I actually hate their product or I don't believe in their product, but hey, let's bring them in. I promise you, I'm like making a pinky swear with you that only the people that I truly believe are going to be amazing contributors to your podcast success are going to be taking a seat on this show. It is my commitment and my responsibility to ensure that every single person that you're listening to is worthwhile, is worth your time. If you never thought about it like this, it's true. Your listeners are giving you their time. And so the last thing that we want to do is to showcase someone that we don't really think will be worthwhile for them. So that's my promise to you. And so what can you expect on these podcasts? I'm a big fan of micro episodes, and so there'll be seasons, but there'll also be seasons of just micro content where maybe it's the holiday season and you're busy. And I want to make sure that you get a few things that you're thinking about in the podcast world. Maybe it's to give you a little bit of insight. But the execution of this podcast is going to be very, very flexible. So I want to take you along with me if I'm going on walks and I'm having thoughts. I want to really show you what's possible for content creation in general, podcasting specifically, because I truly believe that we are living in a time where we ourselves are putting a lot of limitations onto what we think is possible. And a lot of times, inspiration or the best ideas strike not when we are recording in a studio like I am right now, like for instance in my office. Sometimes the best ideas do come to us when we are going for our walks, exercising, moving our bodies, or maybe it is on our way home from a journey or something that just happened. And I want to give you kind of like examples, palpable examples that you can follow along and see, okay, like she did this, so I can do that too. I'm giving you permission to try things. At the end of the day, I want you to feel excited to be podcasting because so many podcasters that I work with kind of forget that it's their show. So remember, it's your podcast. Give yourself permission to have fun, to experiment with things. It's not really about the final outcome. Podcasts are marathons. And so if you fall out of love with a podcast or the process of the podcast that you currently have, remember that it's in your power to change things up and alter the process to make something that is exciting to you maybe in that stage of your life. And so through the different kinds of episodes that I'm going to be doing. Hopefully that provides inspiration and kind of like the technical execution that you need to follow along in order to create a podcast that you love and that you can commit to for the long term. So something else that I wanted to tell you about is that this podcast, as I said earlier, is going to be very interactive. And I want you to always feel free to reach out to me on social media. I'm everywhere at The Podcast Space, and at thepodcastspace.com as a website. You can drop me an email there. But if you have any questions, send those over because I want to answer them live on the show, because if you have them, at least 3 other people are going to have that question, right? And so I want to help you get through those questions faster than if you were by just doing the show yourself or just wondering, hey, how can I fix this? And now a little bit about me. Why the hell am I doing a podcast? Great question. I'd love to tell you. So I'm originally from Portugal. That's actually where I grew up. I'm living in the US right now in Dallas. And something that I always realized when I was little was that I loved communicating with other people. I loved explaining how things work. And I always loved being surrounded by people and creating community around the things that I was involved with. And so that naturally kind of progressed into taking a bachelor's degree in communication and journalism. Now, something that is really exciting about that specific degree is that that's actually where I did my first podcast. So we didn't have what's kind of like the typical radio station. We had like digital radio. And so I got into the process of not doing live radio right away, but like really combining and creating experiences and sound experiences, and then adding text to it, like show notes, articles, whatever there was. And so 2008 was a different time for doing podcasting than it is today. Nothing excites me more than to see people creating podcasts just out of like the great ideas that they had. Trust me, in 2008, the only people who were doing podcasts were people who were, kind of really nerding into the medium that podcasting is, or people who worked in media. And so today, honestly, we live in such an amazing time where you don't need to learn the specifics of editing audio with, the understanding of like what are decibels and what are radio waveforms, all of those things. Like today you can edit podcasts through visual editors, through transcripts. You can send it to someone to do it for you, and you focus on creating content. It's just such a different experience, and I am so grateful that technology has evolved in a way that allows you to do that. Now, something that it was really insightful was that my course actually gave me insight not just into journalism, but PR and multimedia, which today are so in line. But what I really appreciated to this day is actually to be surrounded by people who had my best interests at heart. One of the conversations I will never forget, and this is why I think it's so important to surround yourself with people who truly want the best for you, is that at the end of my radio internship, my mentor told me, Anna, I know that you're doing this journalism thing, but I do believe that you have a lot of energy. I feel like you have a lot of emotion, and I think you'd be better suited for being a radio DJ or a radio host. And at the time, I remember thinking, like, I could hear this in his voice, and I knew he deeply cared about me. That was my pivotal moment. I still did a bit of television and radio as a journalist, but I was actually doing an afternoon show, and I had so much fun. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, he was so right. I really enjoyed this. And so sometimes you think about like, hey, just because I did one degree, it doesn't mean that I cannot like go on these kind of like tangent or go into a completely different path. And so I really enjoy doing that. At some point, my best friend decided that she wanted to go study in London, and she was like, hey, do you want to join me? And I was like, yes. I mean, you're going to the land of the BBC where like radio had and still has today like the biggest development, like the most interesting concepts are being developed there. So of course I want to go. So off I went from Portugal to London in the UK, learned so many cool things about something that is called hospital radio, community radio, online radio. And so online radio, podcasting, all of that kind of like includes a lot of elements of getting your content online, right? So there's like a lot of similarities. And when in London, I worked in really cool projects that involved creating content about the local communities, creating documentaries. But also one of the coolest things were, and I was not responsible for making this happen. I was just part of the team that developed the work. But doing content for a museum and doing content for a borough, like a local council. And that was so amazing. I don't think I would have been able to do that when I was in Portugal. And so I think that like, even though that was community radio, it wasn't like a major radio station. The learnings that I took from there still advise my thinking today. I think it was such a cool way of looking into podcasting, kind of like slightly different. And so these show would go on SoundCloud. And just to think about like SoundCloud was like at the time, like the place to upload your content is wild. But that was great. I also worked in a nonprofit in the digital marketing department. And that is where I learned how to create digital campaigns on a small budget. So yeah, I know you're listening thinking, yeah, Anna, I definitely have a small budget. So definitely that checks out. And so when you're creating content online, social media is such an important way to broadcast your content, right? Like to really connect with listeners deeply. And that job at that nonprofit really got me the skills that I have today about like creating newsletter content, uploading content to a website, and making sure that all of that makes sense. And, you know, creating multimedia content. Where is your content going online on YouTube? And what are the connections between all of those pieces for the person who is on the other side? And so just in a nutshell, I think that that was such a cool experience that got me to combine all of these lessons through life. And I was like, oh, okay, like I have all of these expertise. And then bringing in the fact that I met my husband in London, and then he had to move to Dallas for work. So, of course, I moved here to Dallas. And I got to work in the content department for a PR firm. So we were creating podcasts and distributing it. So live streaming content for clients, all types of clients. So clients that were probably, you know, in their 30s and 40s and 60s and 70s. And so that was incredible because all of these different people had different skill sets. They, some of them did have media training, so they were aware of like where to position yourself on the microphone, where to look in the camera. And other people were doing it just for the first time. They were, you know, just regular people like business owners who had an idea and wanted to create content. So guiding them on the best ways to position themselves, how to position themselves and have a normal conversation with a guest, getting comfortable in front of the camera. All of these things are not easy. And that's when I realized that obviously me coming from a background of actual journalism and having done radio and television, to me, a lot of these things were, you know, kind of, I assumed everybody knew them. But working with people who were realtors, doctors, people from the nonprofit world, what else? Oh, people who were dog trainers, just all of these varied backgrounds helped me understand better how to educate people. Now, I did this for about 2 years and I realized that, hey, I really want to pull together my skill set of understanding content and understanding how to create a brand and align it with a podcast with really helping these podcasters with their whole project. And that's why I actually launched the podcast space. So from just working with people in the studio, I migrated that concept and launched the podcast space because today, you can do everything digitally, and that was such a cool experience to learn that, okay, actually, you don't need to be physically in a studio to support people. You can do virtual studio setups. You can do coaching them through cameras like we're doing today, right? And the pandemic helped me really understand that you don't have to be physically in the same room as someone else in order to help them grow. That was such an interesting transition. And so the podcast space in the beginning of 2020 was really that agency that would help podcasters get their content out there, doing the editing, doing the coaching, getting their content up and available, setting up their show, all of that. But at some point, I learned that I really wanted to just stop doing the production plus the coaching plus the content strategy to helping them exclusively with the content plan. And so it kind of migrated in 2022 to launching my first podcast course, which is called Maximize Your Podcast Content. And as the term goes, obviously, is how to really repurpose your content in a way that helps you grow online without overwhelm. Because I know that you're listening and you're like, yeah, and maximize, that sounds a little overwhelming. I'm already doing so many things. But here's the key. The key is to actually repurpose your podcast as kind of the epicenter of everything you do and not fit the podcast into everything else that you're trying to do. And that's what the lesson that I've learned. I was like, okay, like I, through the years, have learned how podcasters do things that end up in maybe releasing 5 episodes and that's it. Or maybe podcasters really growing their show. What is it that they're doing that can help them, streamline that process even more? Like, what are the steps? And so all of that through the years, like the things that I've learned are the things that I put together on that course. That got me so excited that I was like, okay, what if I was to create a membership? What if I was to develop even more content, educational content that goes up on the website? Because I've been developing a newsletter and creating articles pretty much since the beginning of, I'd say maybe mid 2020. And so it's been a few years now. It's January of 2023. And I've been doing so much. And if anything, if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking, and I am listening to this show because I actually want to start my podcast journey, and you're telling me that I should have started, well, it's never too late to start. And the most important lesson that I have learned so far is that I have done my first podcast in 2008. But today, there are people in the industry that I absolutely adore, podcast experts that started their podcast journey in 2020 or 2021, and they're just incredibly knowledgeable and really understand podcasting. So it's not about just having that legacy of years and years of the industry. Sometimes you can learn so much in a few years that is worthwhile launching a podcast about that. So whether you start in your industry, just now, or if you had a gazillion years behind you and a lot of wealth of experience and knowledge, it doesn't matter. It is time to start a podcast now. And this show, as I mentioned, is going to be helping you build the foundation of really long-term impact. And so I think that's pretty much everything that I have to tell you about this podcast. I wanted to reach out to me, especially I'd say probably the best place is Instagram, because that's my platform. I'm just a very creative person. I know you're creative too, but if you don't have Instagram, you can always reach out to me on any other social media platform, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. Dropping a comment on this video is absolutely fine, or LinkedIn. I'm everywhere at The Podcast Space. So that's THE podcast space. And obviously our website is thepodcastspace.com, where we have a newsletter. You will be able to sign up to our newsletter. It's weekly, it's free, it's super actionable. And I got to say that it's just pretty much the reason why I'm launching this podcast is that so many of you on the newsletters and in real life had mentioned, hey, I really think you should start a podcast. And I was like, I don't know. I've been doing over 7 different, I think, podcasts over the years, but never did one about podcasting. It was always about different things. And so I was like, I guess I must. If I'm a podcast expert, I guess I probably should have a podcast. So if you've been emailing me lately about, okay, you should start a podcast, this is because of you. And so I want to feature questions. I want to be able to help you get unstuck. And so email me at hello@thepodcastspace.com. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button on either YouTube or any podcast platform that you are listening to this on, because I will actually be explaining the reason why people say this. Why do people say subscribe to the podcast? But until then, thank you for listening and keep creating imperfect content that drives you forward. I'll see you next week.